The morning of 6 February 1952, Sandringham House, Norfolk. A valet enters the king's bedroom and finds George VI dead in his bed. He is 56 years old. He has died peacefully in his sleep, which is the kindest detail in an otherwise difficult medical picture. One functioning lung, a cancer nobody told him about, and vascular disease that had been narrowing his arteries since at least 1948. By that evening, his widow had begun to tell the story. For the next 50 years, Queen Elizabeth, the woman Britain would come to call the Queen Mother, held a single, unwavering account of what had killed her husband. Her brother-in-law, King Edward VIII, had abdicated in December 1936 to marry an American divorcée named Wallis Simpson, and in doing so, had forced the crown onto the shoulders of a shy, stammering man built for a quieter life. The stress of that unwanted kingship had broken Bertie. Edward and Wallis had, in effect, destroyed him. This belief, expressed privately to friends and family, and embedded in 50 years of conduct toward the Windsors, hardened into something that felt like settled history. It made her the devoted widow of a martyred king. It worked so completely that many people still half believe it. But the man who died that February morning had been smoking since his teenage years. He had stammered since childhood. He had been in speech therapy for a full decade before the abdication even happened. And the woman now weeping at Sandringham, the woman who would spend the next half-century directing public attention toward her dead brother-in-law, had refused to marry the king twice before she agreed. That last point is where the forensic argument begins. On 27 February 1921, Prince Albert, Duke of York, Bertie to his family, second son of King George V, proposed marriage to Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. She refused him. In a letter written the following day, Elizabeth noted that he had proposed the day before at lunch. Her stated reason, preserved across multiple biographies, was that she was afraid never again to be free to think, speak, and act as I feel I really ought to. Not uncertainty about Bertie's character, not another suitor. Fear of the cage that royal life represented. To understand why that refusal was a genuine calculation rather than false modesty, it helps to understand what Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was refusing from. She was the 9th child of Claude Bowes-Lyon, 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn, and she had grown up between St. Paul's Waldenbury in Hertfordshire and Glamis Castle in Scotland, a castle the family had held since the 14th century, when an ancestor became Thane of Glamis. She was genuine aristocracy, not royal, not common, but part of the ancient social fabric from which the British upper classes drew their particular ease. She had been educated at home until 8, passed the Oxford local examination with distinction at 13, and spoke French fluently. She had a gift for rooms, for entering them and making everyone in them feel they were the most interesting person present. That talent is specific and learnable, and by 1921, she had been deploying it at London balls and country house parties for 3 years. She wasn't short of suitors. A Serbian prince was among those who sought her. James Stuart, one of Albert's own equerries, was also courting her at the time. Stuart would eventually leave Albert's service for a better-paid position in the American oil business, a departure that one account credits to behind-the-scenes maneuvering by friends of the royal family, though the full mechanics of that remain murky. The point is that Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon in 1921 was a young woman who could look at a proposal from a prince of the realm and say no, because she had enough social capital to believe other options would present themselves. Queen Mary, having heard of the refusal, visited Glamis Castle. She came to see for herself the woman her son wanted to marry. She left convinced that Elizabeth was the only woman for her son, and she declined to apply pressure. This is a remarkable piece of restraint for Queen Mary, who wasn't celebrated for restraint in other areas of her children's lives. But she understood, perhaps, that forcing the matter would produce exactly the kind of resentment that was incompatible with the role Elizabeth would need to fill. Albert persisted. In February 1922, Elizabeth served as one of 8 bridesmaids at the wedding of Albert's sister, Princess Mary, to Viscount Lascelles at Westminster Abbey. The following month, Albert proposed again. She refused again. He didn't give up. By early January 1923, he had reached the outer limit of his patience. Before approaching her for the 3rd time, he confided to the Duchess of Devonshire, "This is the last time I'm going to propose to her. It's the 3rd time, and it's going to be the last." The Duchess understood this to be a man announcing his own emotional exhaustion. He had been pursuing the same woman for 2 years. He had been turned down clearly twice, and he had not been able to stop. On 13 January 1923, at St. Paul's Walden-Bury, the Hertfordshire house where Elizabeth had grown up, she agreed to marry him. His telegram to his parents read, "All right, Bertie." 3 words. He was beaming when they visited his parents shortly after. Queen Mary's diary records it simply, "We are delighted, and he looks beaming." Shortly before that meeting, Elizabeth had given a press interview in which she appeared relaxed and laughing, and referred to her fiancé by his family nickname, which King George V found furious in private. She had her own ideas about how a royal engagement was managed. The 2 refusals aren't a minor footnote. A woman swept off her feet by a prince does not say no twice across 2 years before saying yes. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon knew exactly what she was accepting and what she was surrendering. She had named the surrender in her own words, the freedom to think, speak, and act as she felt she ought to. What changed between 1921 and 1923 wasn't that her misgivings disappeared. Multiple biographers confirm they never did, that she accepted despite them, but that she weighed them against what the marriage offered and decided to proceed. What it offered in 1923 was a duchess's title and the life of the 2nd son's household. A royal life, yes, but not the relentless exposure of the throne. The crown wasn't on offer. It arrived 13 years later. By then, it came with a war. Albert Frederick Arthur George was born on 14 December 1895, the 2nd son, and the category defined him from the start. Edward was the heir, celebrated, photographed, mobbed in every dominion of the empire, reported breathlessly by newspapers wherever he went. Albert was the backup. He spent his childhood at York Cottage, Sandringham, in an environment that his biographers consistently describe as emotionally austere. George V kept deliberate distance from his children, was most openly affectionate with his daughter Mary, and operated according to the Victorian principle that children should be seen and feared, not loved. Sarah Bradford's biography quotes George V directly on his philosophy of fatherhood. "I am damned well going to see to it that my children are frightened of me." Albert began to stammer at approximately the age of 8. The onset coincided, biographers suggest, with the pressure of that household. A natural left-hander forced to write with his right hand, a quiet boy expected to be something louder, a sensitive child being raised by people who didn't particularly believe in sensitivity. He was, in Bradford's account, also subjected to the attentions of a cruel nurse who, among other things, fed him on bumpy carriage rides in a way that exacerbated his already fragile stomach. He developed chronic gastric problems that followed him into adulthood. The body kept the account. The stammer was severe enough to mark his public persona for decades. Britannica describes him as shy and prone to melancholy, as a young prince, not as a king. At 19, he delivered his first public speech at the Kingston Yacht Club in Jamaica during a naval tour. It went, his biographers record, very poorly because of his stutter. He was so discomfited by being watched constantly in public, followed, photographed, analyzed, that his discomfort itself became something people commented on. His elder brother, by contrast, seemed to gain energy from observation. Both Albert and Edward began smoking as naval cadets at the Royal Naval College, Osborne. Albert was approximately 15 or 16. This detail rarely appears in the popular narrative about his death, but it anchors the medical argument. The cigarettes preceded the abdication by more than 2 decades, and they preceded the stammer's public consequences by decades more. The stammer became a public disaster on 31 October 1925, when Albert delivered the closing speech at the British Empire exhibition at Wembley, held in the shadow of the vast, newly constructed stadium. The exhibition itself was the empire on display. Pavilions representing Canada, Australia, India, the West African colonies, the full grandeur of British global reach. Hundreds of thousands of people had filed through over the course of the exhibition. The closing ceremony required the Duke of York to speak. He knew what was coming. His biographers described the occasion as an ordeal for both the speaker and those listening. The long pauses, the visible effort, the faces of the crowd uncertain whether to wait or look away. Albert stood at the microphone and fought for every word. He got through it, but the shame of it drove him, finally, to act. In 1926, he sought out Lionel Logue, an Australian speech therapist who had opened a practice at 146 Harley Street in London. Logue had no formal medical qualifications in speech pathology. The field barely existed in that form, but he had developed a combination of breathing exercises, physical relaxation drills, and psychological patience that had worked for other patients, including war veterans with shell shock-induced speech difficulties. The year is everything. 1926 is a full decade before the abdication. Logue wasn't treating a man broken by a constitutional crisis. He was treating a man who had been anxious and stammering since childhood, whose body had been conducting a private war against public performance for 20 years before any crown arrived. Logue's notes from their first session record that Albert was imbued with confidence after their first meeting, phrasing that implies the baseline was near total absence of it. The therapy worked, gradually. The approach combined deliberate breathing exercises with what Logue described as superhuman sympathy. He believed anxious patients needed patience more than technique. By 1927, Albert was speaking confidently enough to open the new Parliament House in Canberra during an Australian tour with Elizabeth. But Logue remained a fixture. He was invited to the royal family's Christmas dinner to assist with the Christmas message. For major speeches, he was present in the building. For some, he was present in the room. George VI didn't feel comfortable delivering a significant address without Logue physically beside him until December 1944, 18 years after they began. That number is the measure of the baseline anxiety, 18 years of continuous therapeutic support to manage something that predated the abdication, predated the marriage, predated almost everything the standard narrative invokes as cause. Albert and Elizabeth married on 26 April 1923 at Westminster Abbey, the first royal wedding there since 1382. Elizabeth entered in deep ivory chiffon moiré, embroidered with pearls and silver thread, and did something unprecedented. On her way into the Abbey, she laid her bouquet at the tomb of the unknown warrior, in memory of her brother Fergus, who had been killed at the Battle of Loos in 1915. Nobody had told her to do it. It was spontaneous, and it was noticed. Every royal bride since has laid her bouquet at the tomb, after the ceremony, not before. Elizabeth did it walking in. That instinct for the gesture that lands, the moment that embeds itself in the public imagination, that was already present in 1923, before any of the larger stages arrived. On the 10th December 1936, Edward VIII signed the Instrument of Abdication. The following day, Albert became King George VI. His private reaction, described across multiple accounts, was that he wept like a child when he learned what had happened. The scale of what had just landed on him wasn't abstract. A BBC analysis of the abdication's impact on the Yorks captures it with a single sentence. The event had propelled the 36-year-old Duchess of York from relative obscurity to become Queen Empress, reigning with her husband over 600 million subjects. The man who was described by contemporaries as excessively shy, very retiring, very nervous, and resistant to appearing in public at all, was now the symbolic head of the largest empire in the world. At the moment, that empire was sliding toward its second catastrophic war in 25 years. 3 weeks after his accession, on his 41st birthday, George VI invested Elizabeth with the Order of the Garter. A detail: he had to buy from his brother the royal residences of Balmoral Castle and Sandringham House because they were Edward's private property and had not automatically transferred. The new king had to purchase his own home. The gossip, according to George VI's Wikipedia entry, spread almost immediately that Albert was physically and psychologically incapable of being king. Court circles, the press, people doubted whether the stammering, nervous second son could hold the institution together at the moment when the institution most needed holding. No evidence was ever found to support the rumor that the government considered bypassing him entirely in favor of his younger brother, Prince George, Duke of Kent. But the fact that the rumor circulated at all tells you something about how he was perceived. His coronation at Westminster Abbey took place on the 12th May 1937, the date that had originally been planned for Edward VIII. The crown they placed on his head was, in one sense, a borrowed occasion. Nothing about the kingship had been prepared for Albert. His private secretary, his staff, his public schedule, all of it had to be constructed around a man who had not expected to need it. The demands of wartime kingship, beginning 3 years after his coronation, were genuine and sustained. His weekly Tuesday lunches with Winston Churchill, private, no aides present, became one of the quiet institutions of the conflict. Churchill initially had reservations about the king. George VI had initially preferred Lord Halifax as Prime Minister. Both men overcame those reservations. In one letter to his mother, the king wrote that, "We are beginning to understand each other." And Churchill later compared the king and queen favorably to what the situation would have been under Edward VIII. It wasn't a sentimental assessment, it was a military one. When the Luftwaffe began bombing London in September 1940, the king and queen stayed. Buckingham Palace took several direct hits. On one occasion, a German aircraft flew directly down the mall and dropped its bombs while the king and queen were in the building. Elizabeth later said, "I'm glad we've been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." The East End was being leveled. Her remark wasn't self-pity. It was, in its way, a piece of political genius, the kind of instinct she had that George VI didn't. The gift for the right phrase in the right moment that drew people toward the monarchy rather than away from it. George VI toured the East End alongside her, visited factories, appeared at bomb sites still smoking. He made the radio broadcasts that helped hold the nation together through the worst of the Blitz, many recorded in sections because of his stammer. He visited troops in North Africa in 1943 at Churchill's request. Harold Macmillan described it as a tremendous success. He wasn't built for display, but he showed up for it anyway, every time, for 15 years. Sarah Bradford's biography renders the arc plainly. Although George wasn't born to be king, he died a great one. He rose to the role. The question isn't whether the crown cost him something, it cost him enormously, but whether the crown was the primary cause of what killed him, or one aggravating factor in a picture his wife's preferred explanation collapsed into a single cause. The medical record is about cigarettes. By 1948, Peripheral vascular disease had become clinically apparent in George VI, a condition in which years of arterial damage had narrowed the blood supply to his extremities. He was 52. In March 1949, he underwent surgery to improve circulation in his right leg. His biographers note that he was visibly aging faster than his years. The following 2 years brought intermittent recovery and relapse. By the autumn of 1951, he had returned from Balmoral visibly diminished, thin, pale, with limited exercise tolerance. The phrase used by his physicians was intermittent claudication, pain on walking, caused by insufficient blood supply to the muscles, characteristic of severe arterial disease in the legs. His physicians, including Sir Daniel Davies, Sir Horace Evans, and Geoffrey Marshall, ordered him to return from Balmoral to London and rest. He didn't improve. X-rays were ordered. Peter Curley, a radiologist at Westminster Hospital, reviewed the films. He identified a shadow consistent with a tumor in the left lung. On 16 September 1951, a bronchoscopy and biopsy were performed. Brian Price Thomas, the son of the surgeon who would operate, transported the sample to the Brompton Hospital in a container the size of a small jar. The result confirmed a lung tumor. The diagnosis was then concealed from the king, from the public, and from most of the medical profession. George VI was told the surgery was to remove a blockage. The palace announced the problem as structural abnormalities of the left lung. The word cancer didn't appear in any public communication. On Sunday morning, 23 September 1951, the Buell Room at Buckingham Palace was converted into an operating theatre. The changing of the guard outside was relocated to St. James's Palace for the day to prevent any disturbance near the room. Sir Clement Price Thomas, leading thoracic surgeon from Westminster Hospital, led the operating team, assisted by Charles Edwin Drew and Peter Jones. The procedure was a left total pneumonectomy, the complete removal of the left lung. Price Thomas was known for his precision and for his theatricality. At one point during the operation, when a junior surgeon moved to close the wound, Price Thomas reportedly remarked, "I haven't stitched up a chest for 25 years, and I'm not going to start practicing today," declining the offer and doing it himself. The king was moved back to his own bedroom following surgery, and the entire operation had taken place in the palace that was simultaneously running as a working royal residence. The pathology confirmed bronchial carcinoma. The left lung was gone. Recovery was slow. Hemoptysis, coughing up blood, continued in the weeks that followed, indicating the disease had already spread to the right lung. He was living with one remaining lung and advancing malignancy, and his physicians had decided he shouldn't know. His 1951 Christmas broadcast was recorded in multiple takes and edited together, reflecting his diminished physical capacity 3 months post-surgery. He had lost significant weight. His voice, already affected by the damage the pneumonectomy had caused to his left recurrent laryngeal nerve, had changed. He died in his sleep at Sandringham on 6 February 1952. His valet found him at approximately 7:30 in the morning. The official cause of death recorded was coronary thrombosis, a blood clot in a coronary artery. A 2021 reassessment published in the journal Cardiovascular Pathology by pathologists Rolf Barth and L. Maximilian Buja proposed that, given the documented carcinoma, the ongoing hemoptysis, and the recent pneumonectomy, the actual mechanism was more likely a pulmonary embolus or a massive intrathoracic hemorrhage, complications of the spreading lung cancer, rather than a primary cardiac event unconnected to it. The disease process had been advancing since at least 1948, rooted in a smoking habit that began at a naval college in the early 20th century when Albert was barely old enough to shave. How heavily did he smoke? The clinical record is incomplete, and the figures vary between sources. Sarah Bradford's 1989 biography provides the most specific observational account. 2 cigarettes and a cigar in the morning, followed by approximately 20 more cigarettes by dinner, a portrait of a man for whom the cigarette was as constant as breathing. A historical medical study describes him as reputed to have puffed 40 to 50 cigarettes a day, explicitly noting this as a reputation rather than a measured clinical figure. The 2021 pathology paper estimates a 40-year smoking history, possibly 2 packs per day. The numbers differ in their precision. They agree completely on the duration and the scale. Sir Clement Price Thomas, who removed the king's lung in that palace bedroom, was himself a chain smoker, reportedly carrying at least 50 cigarettes in his pocket during his working day. In 1964, Price Thomas developed lung cancer. Charles Drew, one of the assistants from the king's 1951 operation, performed a lobectomy on Price Thomas for the same disease. The surgeon who had tried to save the king from his cigarettes was destroyed by his own. Price Thomas died in 1973 at 79, still, in a grim way, an advertisement for what tobacco eventually does, even to the man holding the scalpel. The Queen Mother's preferred explanation, the abdication, the unwanted throne, the stress of a role her husband was never meant to carry, had the emotional coherence of genuine grief. It also had the structural convenience of directing all attention away from the most documentable cause of what happened to her husband's lungs. Nobody in Britain was positioned to say, "The widow of the beloved king is telling you half the story." From 1952 onward, the Queen Mother's conduct toward the Windsors was consistent, sustained, and effective. The Duke of Windsor attended George VI's funeral at St. George's Chapel in Windsor in February 1952. The Duchess of Windsor didn't. When Queen Elizabeth II was crowned on 2 June 1953, neither the Duke nor the Duchess received an invitation. When Queen Mary died later that same year, the Duke attended. The Duchess didn't. Through the 1950s and 1960s, the Windsors were largely excluded from royal occasions in Britain, the Duke occasionally present when unavoidable, the Duchess almost never. Their Paris exile wasn't softened by rehabilitation. When they were occasionally invited to events, it was at the edge of the frame rather than at its center. The Queen Mother's specific role in these exclusions can't always be traced to a single document bearing her name alone. The decisions were collective: the monarch, the government, the palace advisors. But William Shawcross, drawing on the Royal Archives for the official 2009 biography, with more primary access than any other biographer has had, confirms she never forgave the Duke and consistently supported policies limiting Windsor rehabilitation. She believed Bertie had been driven to an early grave by a role forced on him after Edward's abdication. She believed her husband was never strong enough to bear the burden. These are Shawcross's findings from her private papers, not a journalist's interpretation. 2 specific written documents give the attitude texture. In 1940, she wrote to Lord Lloyd, the colonial secretary, describing the Duchess of Windsor as the lowest of the low. That letter exists in the historical record and has been cited in multiple accounts of the period. A second letter, written around the same time to Walter Monckton, Edward's chief personal advisor during and after the abdication crisis, was withheld from the public when the rest of the Monckton archive at the Bodleian Library was opened in March 2000. The letter is believed, according to contemporaneous press reporting, to contain even more vitriol. Under current restrictions, it remains sealed until 2037. The phrase, "that woman," widely attributed to the Queen Mother in reference to Wallis Simpson, has become so deeply embedded in the popular historical record that Anne Seba used it as the title of her 2012 biography of Wallis, noting that Wallis had been referred to in those terms by the Queen Mother and other members of the royal family. Multiple royal historians have noted, however, that they haven't been able to locate a specific, dated contemporaneous document in which the Queen Mother personally wrote or was recorded saying exactly those words. The hostility is documented. The specific phrase exists in the record as reported speech, passed down through decades of second-hand testimony, rather than as a confirmed archival quotation. This distinction is worth making clearly, because the Queen Mother was, among other things, careful about what she committed to paper. Careful about some things, at least. The 1940 letter to Lord Lloyd, calling Wallis the lowest of the low, wasn't careful at all. It was the letter of a woman who was furious, and who felt secure enough in her position to commit that fury to the colonial secretary during wartime. The Duke of Windsor died of throat cancer in Paris on 28 May 1972. His body was brought back to Britain, and on 5 June 1972, his funeral was held at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. The Queen Mother attended, along with Queen Elizabeth II and the Duke of Edinburgh. The Duchess of Windsor also attended, heavily veiled, visibly frail. She was 75, and the journey from Paris had taxed her. The chapel was the same one where Edward had abdicated 36 years earlier, in spirit, if not in physical ceremony. The Queen Mother's conduct at the funeral was described in contemporary and subsequent accounts as formally correct and emotionally distant. She was present. She wasn't warm. No sources record a dramatic scene or a confrontation. The absence of warmth was the point. Privately, across the decades of widowhood, the Queen Mother's interpretation of George VI's death remained unchanged. Friends, courtiers, and biographers who had access to her in later life record her still referring to what Edward did to Bertie, the abdication producing an unprepared king, the kingship producing an early death, the responsibility lying with those who caused the first event. No acknowledgement of the 40 years of cigarettes. No acknowledgement that the man she had married had been stammering and anxious since childhood, that his constitutional fragility had preceded her by decades. The logic she had constructed was airtight because she was the last person with both the standing and the longevity to be challenged on it. Who argues with the Queen Mother? Who examines the chain of causation while she is still alive and publicly mourning? She lived to 101. She outlasted any reasonable period in which the question could have been raised in public life without seeming monstrous. Edward VIII himself offered a different reading of the marriage. Writing after the abdication, he complained of Bertie's ignominious capitulation to the wiles of his ambitious wife. Shawcross records it. The Guardian's review of the official biography cites it. It's easy to dismiss as sour grapes from a man who had surrendered his position and resented the brother who kept it. But the phrase pointed at a question the official narrative had carefully arranged not to see. In a marriage between a man who sobbed like a child and a woman who berated the departing king to his face for shameful dereliction of duty, the question of who held more power had a complicated answer. The BBC account of the abdication's impact on the Duchess of York includes one revealing detail. Though outwardly sanguine about the prospect of becoming queen, the Duchess told one of her household, "We must take what is coming and make the best of it." Behind the scenes, she was livid. And separately, she berated the king, to his face, for what she considered to be his shameful dereliction of duty. Both reactions, the measured public face and the private fury, are characteristic. She was almost never caught between them. The official widow knew which way the camera was pointing. The honest assessment of the marriage requires holding two accounts simultaneously, because one account is authorized and one is contested. William Shawcross's 2009 biography, drawn from the Royal Archives and private papers, presents Elizabeth as genuinely devoted to George VI, as the person most responsible for enabling his public function, and as sincerely grieved rather than strategically calculating when she attributed the abdication as the cause of his death. Shawcross is the source with the deepest primary access. His account can't be dismissed. Lionel Logue himself wrote to the Queen Mother after the king's death, "No man ever worked as hard as he did and achieved such a grand result. During all those years you were a tower of strength to him, and he has often told me how much he has owed to you." She replied that she knew, perhaps better than anyone, just how much you helped the king, not only with his speech, but through that his whole life and outlook on life. These letters, now in the National Archives, record something real. A husband who loved his wife and depended on her. A wife who understood the depth of that dependence with something like pride in having sustained it. Lady Colin Campbell's 2012 contrarian biography, The Queen Mother, The Untold Story, argues that Elizabeth was ambitious and controlling, that she held more power in the marriage than the official account allowed, and that the devoted wife image was partly a construction. Critics have consistently noted that Campbell relies heavily on anonymous sources, and that her more dramatic claims have been rated by mainstream royal historians as poorly evidenced. Campbell is a contrarian with a weaker evidential base than Shawcross. Her specific claims about the marriage can't be stated as established fact. What neither biography contests is the biographical contrast, and the contrast is the most honest data the argument has. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon entered the marriage as a woman of natural social confidence, public charisma, and easy command of situations that produced visible strain in her husband. French Prime Minister Edward VIII described her before the war as an excessively ambitious young woman who would sacrifice any other country in the world to remain queen. Adolf Hitler, according to accounts of the period, called her the most dangerous woman in Europe. He meant it as a threat assessment, recognizing that her popularity created a symbolic barrier to German cultural dominance. Eleanor Roosevelt, who observed the royal couple closely during their 1939 American tour, said Elizabeth was perfect as a queen, gracious, informed, saying the right thing and kind, but a little self-consciously regal. None of these observers described her as a fragile woman holding on alongside a suffering husband. They described a woman who was, in every room she entered, entirely in command of the room. George VI's letters to Elizabeth, examined by Sally Bedell Smith across 3 months in the Royal Archives, are described as breezy and affectionate. A portrait of a man who was comfortable with his wife in a way he was comfortable with very few things. The marriage appears to have been a real one, with real warmth. But warmth and dependence coexist easily, and the question the Queen Mother's narrative quietly foreclosed was whether her husband's dependence on her had its own costs alongside its obvious benefits. She lived to 101. He died at 56. She outlived him by half a century, maintaining a full public diary into her 90s, completing more than 40 official foreign visits after his death, serving as patron or president of approximately 350 organizations. She bought the Castle of May in the north of Scotland in 1953, the extreme northeast corner of the country, and spent weeks there each August and October. She attended horse races. She hosted gossipy lunches. She kept steeplechasers. Shawcross notes that one decade glided into another in her widowhood, a phrase that captures something almost serene about the pace of it. The public adored her. She gave them exactly what a queen mother was supposed to give, and she gave it without visible effort. George VI's last decade moved in the opposite direction. Vascular surgery in 1949, the left lung removed in September 1951, a cancer diagnosis withheld from him, a Christmas broadcast recorded in sections 3 months after the operation, death on a February morning in the house he'd grown up in. The two biographical trajectories are the most honest available data on what the marriage and the crown together cost each of them, and what each of them was constitutionally equipped to bear. George VI died at 56, with one lung, after a lifetime of cigarettes and 15 years of a crown he never asked for. His wife outlived him by half a century, spending every year of it telling the same story, that his brother and that woman had killed him. It was a story that made her the devoted widow of a martyred king, and it worked so completely that we still half believe it. But the cigarettes were his own. The smoking started at Osborne when he was a teenager, and the left lung that Sir Clement Price Thomas removed from a palace bedroom on 23 September 1951 was already producing the cancer that would end him, shaped by 40 years of tobacco, not 15 years of stress. The throne cost him something real. The abdication added weight to a frame already under strain. The war demanded things of him that were genuinely difficult and physically wearing. All of that is true, and none of it's diminished by also being true that his lungs were already failing him for reasons that predated the abdication entirely. The story the Queen Mother told collapsed the distance between those partial truths and a single tidy cause. And the single tidy cause happened to be the one that made her the martyr's widow rather than anything more complicated. It let Britain grieve alongside her, admire her, reward her with the affection she received for 5 decades of public life. It let the actual mechanism of his death, the carcinoma in the left lung, the hemoptysis suggesting spread to the right, the 40-year habit that began at a naval training college, recede behind the more morally satisfying explanation of a brother's selfishness. She didn't kill him. The evidence doesn't support that, and it would be reckless to suggest it does. She just made very sure that we would never look too closely at who he had actually married. Subscribe for more stories like this.